Well, hey, welcome to session 3. This is obviously the one where you're going to get really warm and comfortable after having had lunch, and you're going to feel the arms are going to fold, and you might find yourself doing that. I get it. I've been there. I am there. What I'm going to do in this lesson is I'm going to talk briefly about the Christian nationalism question, and then I have a lot of questions that I'm going to try to get through rapid fire. Let me begin by stating this about the Christian nationalism conversation. Whenever the Christian nationalist label or conversation occurs, the first thing out of your mouth ought to be this: what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? The reason that is so is because often how that term is invoked, and the meaning of the term, is dependent upon who is using the term. I find myself in a peculiar position as a Baptist thinker, Baptist public theologian, because if you know anything about the Baptist tradition, Baptists have strongly affirmed the separation of church and state, not the separation of religion and politics. That's a separate conversation. You can't separate religion and politics. You can separate the jurisdictions of the church or a denomination and the apparatus of government. I affirm that, yes and amen. So the Baptist tradition does not naturally give itself to what we hear when we hear the term Christian nationalism. Now here's the paradox or the quandary or the challenge, is that most of the individuals who would identify themselves as so-called Christian nationalists are individuals who I have about 98% of everything else in common with them, pertaining to doctrinal integrity, pertaining to the infallibility and the inerrancy of scriptures, pertaining to basically biblical orthodoxy. There are a lot of Christian nationalists that I very, very, very much agree with. What I love about some of the Christian nationalists is that they're very strongly pro-socially conservative, as I am. The problem with some of the so-called those who embrace the label of Christian nationalism is that they want to take that social conservatism that I like and then wed that to the state and to politicians that I think is not biblically warranted, and then doesn't actually have the historical evidence at its disposal to prove to us that it's actually useful or successful in the long run. So, for example, and I say this with all due respect because the individual is very intelligent, and I'm not going to question someone's character or their intentions. I want to speak about the convictions themselves and challenge the convictions. But so there's a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism by an author named Stephen Wolfe that has made a lot of waves. If you want to read a Baptist critique of that volume, I wrote a critique of that in an issue of the 9 Marks Journal that came out sometime in 2022 or 2023. There's a whole issue of the 9 Marks Journal dedicated to a Baptist critique of theonomy, postmillennialism, and Christian nationalism. So that's online if you want to read it, a critique of Stephen Wolfe's book. The general principle of that book is that cultures and governments can organize themselves to further their Christian identity, which sounds great on the one hand. The question then becomes, how is that done? And in Stephen Wolfe's book, it's done through what he calls the Christian Prince. And this is a so-called great-souled man who has the eyes of the nation affixed and appointed on him to usher in kind of the Christian ideal of the state. The problem is, and doesn't often happen when you read a book, I'm reading the book and you're reading it, and you read past a sentence and you do a double take and you're thinking, did I just read what I thought I read? And I went back and read the sentence, and there was a sentence in there that said, in principle, in the ideal Christian nationalist state, it would be okay to execute non-believers and infidels who pose a problem to the state, and to do this in the name of Christianity. Let me suggest that when that has occurred in history, it's never gone well. It's never gone well for the infidel or the unbeliever who ends up getting their head cut off or burned at the stake. It also doesn't go well for the state itself. Because this gets back to a question about what is the state. In my view as a Baptist, thinking covenantally, the state or the government is not an object of the covenant of redemption. That's very important. I know it's a lot of Baptist seminarian language, but the state is not an object of the covenant of redemption. The state, as I understand it, is an object of the covenant of creation. Meaning that the purpose of the government is not to steward man to man's ultimate eternal end. It is to steward man according to man's temporal common good, not the eternal good. Because what we see in Scripture, in Romans 13, there's no mandate in Scripture that governments be exhaustively Christian or exclusively Christian for the state to be legitimate. Why? Because the state is not seen as a vessel or mechanism to announce or proclaim the gospel. We are Baptists. We believe that the local church is the God-appointed means to proclaim and announce the gospel as an institutional reality. The government is not designed to proclaim the gospel. Why? Because there can be unbelief within the apparatus of government. Unbelief proclaiming a gospel it doesn't believe isn't preaching the gospel. That's called moralism. That's called nominalism. Nominal Christians go to hell. Born-again Christians go to heaven. The government is not competent to administer eternal realities. Where it has tried to do so, it has done so ineffectively, and it has done so at the expense of making the church look like a hypocrite by playing chaplain to a culture that is paganizing and secularizing, while having the bishops in Parliament sit back and applaud while everyone goes to hell. The Anglican establishment has not created a more healthy Anglican church. It has not created a more Christian England. Why is that? Think about this as Baptists. When you begin to define things as Christian that aren't actually Christian, which Christian means regenerate, you begin to haphazardly apply that label in ways that make things that make unregenerate things think that they're regenerate. That's not how we do things as a Baptist, in my opinion. So I'm in this interesting position as a Baptist thinker in that I'm very doctrinally, socially, politically, theologically conservative, but I disagree with a lot of doctrinally, theologically, socially, politically conservative so-called Christian nationalists because we're 90% on the same team or 95% on the same team, and I just have a disagreement at the church and state question. And listen, the good thing here is I don't think we should anathematize those on this question that we disagree with. For example, a good friend of mine is Joe Rigney. There's a book in the bookstore by Joe Rigney. I love Joe. He's a dear brother. We love to poke at each other over this issue in kind of a brotherly, fun way. We do have a stern disagreement on the matter, but it's a brotherly disagreement. Now, let me bring me to the next thing I wanted to say about the Christian nationalism conversation that probably relates more to you all in this room. I've heard recently that it has been suggested that you all are Christian nationalists because you want a school policy to represent sanity and decency pertaining to some gender questions. Is that the basic question? And the accusations of Christian nationalism got thrown around. Guess what? To the New York Times editorial board, I'm a Christian nationalist. You're a Christian nationalist. Even though I do not wear the label of Christian nationalist myself. Why are you a Christian nationalist in the eyes of the watching world? Because it is simply the latest iteration of progressivism or unbelief's attempt to drive conservative Christianity out of the public square. In previous iterations, it was the moral majority. It was the Christian right. It was you're a theonomist. You are part of the Christian right. Maybe I already said that already. Every generation creates these new insults or epithets to make your entry into the public square barred and unwelcome because you're imposing your morality on others. But then you, the people who make that say, you can't enter the public square because you're a Christian nationalist. Then what do? They come in and enter the public square with their values. They impose their morality on the public square because their morality is relying upon so-called public reason, which comes from someone named John Rawls, who said you can only make arguments on the grounds that everyone agrees with how the argument is being made. Well, if it's a religious argument, religion comes from people with sectarian beliefs, and that's an imposition. Okay, well, the problem is requiring you to banish your religious views is also a form of secular morality being imposed on you all. This is why, to come full circle, questions of the natural law are so important. Because it allows us to say, well, actually, the morality that I do want, and let's be clear about this, I do want to impose my morality. And I don't apologize for that. But my morality that I think I would impose on everybody else is not necessarily going to make everyone a Christian. It is going to help everyone live in accordance with how they were meant to live as a human being. Because political morality is based on natural law morality. Natural law morality comes from Genesis 1 and 2 morality. And Genesis 1 and 2 morality is all-encompassing, that encapsulates every single human being on this planet. Every single human being on this planet needs to live. They need to know if they're a male or a female. They need to arrange their lives in such a way that they could get married at some point. If that's Christian nationalism, guess what? The whole world has been Christian nationalist. But this is simply the latest iteration to say, you are the conservative, fundamentalist Christian, get your gay-bashing, racist views out of here, and let us operate with how we want without having any moral accountability. Again, this is a bait and switch. You can't impose your morality, but we're going to impose our morality. And that's the challenge of this conversation, is I'm not a Christian nationalist. As a Baptist, I find that deeply incongruent with Baptist identity. I'm also a deeply socially conservative Christian who wants to impose my morality. Where does that leave me? Where does that leave all of you? We just need clarity whenever this term emerges. That's what is needed. All right, I'm going to move on to some questions now that you all have submitted. I will try to answer these as quick as possible. Okay, one second. Okay, so how can a young adult get involved to speak truth and be active practically in local politics? I think that is an education campaign first and foremost. Is where are you going to figure out who your elected officials are? It's decisions you're making on a daily basis. Are you going to subscribe to the 100th YouTuber who is talking about video gaming? Or will you subscribe to Allie Beth Stuckey's Relatable podcast that talks about politics and culture from a millennial perspective. My challenge to the young people in the room is to figure out, and you might even know this better than me because I'm a millennial, but I'm not Gen Z. I don't know where all the Gen Z youths hang out these days. But asking the question, and that is one of the beauties of social media in this age, is that you can end up finding cohorts with individuals who see the world similarly to you. But the biggest question is, are you using Google properly? Are you reading the news on a daily basis? I taught a class a few years ago, and I asked the students, how many of you read the news on a daily basis? And it was like 2 out of a class of 40. Okay? That's not good. Karl Barth, famous theologian who I disagree with basically everything about, did say something really smart. He said, a Christian should begin their day with the Bible and the newspaper. Bible first, then the newspaper. I think that is basic stewardship of showing care and concern for the world in which you live. Being woefully politically ignorant is not responsible. It's a form of abdication. That doesn't mean that you have to be consuming as many newsletters as I'm consuming on an everyday morning basis. But it means that you need to read the news. You need to read National Review. You should check out the Wall Street Journal. You should read the Daily Caller. There is a plethora of good resources out there. The Daily Signal, World Opinions, World Magazine. It's all out there at the ease of your fingertips. You just got to go there. Okay, here's a good question. Could you comment on the posting of the 10 Commandments in public buildings? I can, and I will. That sounds like something that a Baptist would say no to, right? Because why would you allow religion to be put inside of a government building if you, Mr. Professor, just said the government doesn't have a role in perpetuating religion? Okay, well, my answer to that is, it is without a doubt the case that Western law and the American experiment is heavily indebted to the 10 Commandments. It is a historical fact. You don't have the development of the concept of the rule of law. I just taught a class literally last semester on Christianity and the law. The notion of the rule of law comes from Christianity. The notion of human rights comes from Christianity. The notion of equality under the law comes from Christianity. So my idea of posting the 10 Commandments in a public school building, public building, whatever, what have you, is not because I think that is necessarily going to make the nation more Christian, but because it is more or less a civics lesson in us understanding that nations do not emerge out of vacuums. They emerge out of particular socio-historical contexts that have been reliant upon previous generations, handing down traditions and religious faith through successive generations. And moreover, I think that as a Baptist, I want to figure out a way to affirm this notion, and I have it here in my notes. John Adams said this: our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any others. I think that government should find ways to promote the good of religion without trying to perpetuate one particular religion, because the idea that religion serves a public good, on the one hand, by reminding us that government is not total, it's not sovereign, that individuals with their consciences are going to disagree on who the identity of God is, but individuals should be free insofar as they're not causing a threat to public harm or public safety, the public good, in how they understand that religion to be. So I think it's good for the government to be open-handed towards religion and not just militantly secularist in its view on religion. Last thing I'll say in the 10 Commandments is I actually think of the 10 Commandments as formulations of the natural law. So principles like don't murder, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't have affairs. those are principles of the natural law that everyone needs to learn. Can we mandate that everyone follow the first commandment and the second commandment and the third commandment and the fourth commandment? We can't mandate it. But I'm not opposed to people saying it and reading it and wondering, maybe I should consider this thousands of year old faith being handed down here that formed the legal bedrock of Western civil order. All right, another question. Is women running for office against creation order? Does the type of office matter? School board versus Congress. Should women engage politically differently than men? Let me ask the running for office question. As we look backwards in human history, it is the case that men have been in the dominant position of leadership in basically every society in the history of the world. That could be because of a couple reasons. It could be because of pure happenstance and coincidence, and there's no reason for that. It could be because of misogyny, that men just are in the interest of suppressing women's rights. Or a third option could be, well, history is a teacher in a way, and there's something about the preternatural nature of masculinity and masculine expression that naturally lends itself to leadership in society. That would be my position, the third. Does that mean that women can't run for office? No, I don't think it means that. Does it mean I wouldn't vote for a female for president? No, I would. If it were Joe Biden versus Nikki Haley, I'm voting for Nikki Haley, and that's an easy decision. Does it mean in my worldview that I think it is unlikely, given my views on creation order and natural law and what history has taught us, is it likely the case that it'll most often be the case that men are the leaders in a society? Yes, that is my case. I do believe that. I understand that may make some people upset, but that is my settled conviction. We can talk afterwards. Register your complaints with Pastor Steve. Okay, this is a good one. On creating laws to allow for human flourishing, what should we do with issues related to drug use, particularly the debate over marijuana for recreational use? Yeah, that's a great question. The best I can liken this to is I think of marijuana use as a violation of the Bible's command to not be drunk. I think it's intentional intoxication with the intention of lessening one's grip on reality. So there's the personal level. At the social level, I think there can be legitimate debates on how you disincentivize it. Do you call it a misdemeanor? Do you call it a felony? I think there's a legitimate application the law can think about, like how to penalize it, or how to penalize it. But if you're asking me, would I ever support the legalization of marijuana? No, I would not. Here's why. Every single place recreational marijuana has gotten legalized, it's led to the degradation of the surrounding culture. It just leads to other loosening of moral boundaries. So in Colorado, which was one of the first states to loosen its laws on recreational marijuana, you had an increase in tax revenue, yay, right? Coupled with cataclysmic numbers of high school dropouts. Public policy is often met with offsets and trade-offs. Tax revenue, so that you can spend less on your property taxes, seems a bad bet when you are creating permission structures for people to have access to things that are likely statistically to lead to some bad stuff. Whether it leads to addiction, whether it leads to sexual abuse, whether it leads to absentee fatherhood, childhood or high school dropout rates. And there's some prudence here, right? Prudence, we talked about that in the second lecture. I think there's some reasonable ways we can have some disagreements here about this. But I think once we go down the drug legalization lane, it's a Faustian bargain. We think we're getting something that in the long run it turns out to have really kind of gotten us on the back end. Here's a really good question. Respond to the mentality of abortion abolitionists who say to compromise politically is wrong. Very good question. I have tremendous respect for abolitionism as a movement to overcome abortion. I would consider myself an hypothetical idealist abolitionist because my ideal would be the elimination of abortion in our society. My problem and concern with some of those who would identify as abolitionists is that they take an all or nothing approach. So that if we don't have immediate 14th Amendment protection for the unborn, any action taken to eliminate or restrict access to abortion is considered trying to legalize acceptable forms of baby murder. I understand that concern. It's a very valid concern. My worldview is one of, I mentioned this earlier, I'm an ameliorist. I want to gain as much as I can, make as much progress as I can, stop as much rot as I can while holding on to that moral ideal. So I would like to be able to get something even if I can't get everything. And so my concern, and I say this with tremendous respect, I have friends in the abolitionist camp. They're brothers and sisters. Again, no insult intended to them whatsoever. I feel like they have a pretty naive understanding of how politics works. It requires assembling majorities in order to accomplish shared goals. And simply saying 14th Amendment now, 14th Amendment now, 14th Amendment now does not actually affect the change. And in the process, it eliminates meaningful restrictions from being passed. But again, I say that with all love and respect. Another question. If the Christian is to organize society in accordance with natural law, God's moral law, do you consider yourself to be a theonomist? Why or why not? Wonderful question. I do not consider myself to be a theonomist, capital T, which is a movement that you associate with degrees of Presbyterianism. I consider myself perhaps a lowercase t, general equity theonomist of a sort, because theonomy, what is that? Theo is Greek for God. Nomos is Latin for law. So everyone in here is a theonomist of a sort because we believe in the sovereignty and goodness of God's law. Theonomy as a movement, capital T, with the likes of Gary North, Rousas, Rushdoony, was a movement that wanted to have a very strict application of the Mosaic civil law to modern civil law. So all of the penalties handed down in the Old Testament would be the penalties that U.S. civil law should adopt right now. I don't find that covenantally a persuasive argument because all of the laws in the Old Covenant are not binding in all of the same way. There are moral laws, civil laws, ceremonial laws. Ceremonial laws fulfilled in the person of Christ. Moral laws are always and forever binding on all times. And then civil laws are unique civil laws to that particular time and place. And I think of Israel as actually the exception to the norm for how nations are to govern themselves. But all that to say, what do we have here? We have the fact that you have to have the moral law. God's moral law in the Old Covenant is not based first in the Mosaic Covenant. Where is God's moral law rooted? Genesis 1 and 2. We keep coming back to that, right? So my problem is not that I think theonomists are wrong in all of the prescriptions that they would propose for society. It's that I don't think that they are going to the right place covenantally to derive their basis for where laws should be derived today. I don't think we go to Exodus or Deuteronomy for our laws. I think we should go to Genesis 1 and 2 and Genesis 9 for our laws. I like this question. How in the world are we supposed to engage and talk to those whose worldview is so very different? We can't even communicate because they believe in things that don't even exist, such as non-binary children. That's a great question. My experience in dealing with individuals who seem to be on a different planet morally is to be kind, to be respectful, to be disagreeable, and to ask questions. Help them test the consistency of their own worldview. I think that our society is going so far over the cliff right now that the evangelistic strategy I find to be useful would be, where do you find joy and purpose and hope? How's that working out for you? Because if Christianity is true and individuals are finding their hope and purpose in sexual fulfillment, in a particular identity, what do we know that to be true? We know that they're actually deceived and that thing is not actually delivering on the promise that it's offering. And there's probably some unfulfilled desire, an unrequited need in their heart that then allows you to say, well, how's that working out for you? It probably isn't working out for them. And I think those provide gospel opportunities to have some non-confrontational questions that can have some meaningful good. I think I said this in the first lecture. It has also been my experience that sometimes conversations simply do stop. And that doesn't mean they have to permanently stop. It doesn't mean that you are then rude and aggressive and you're an idiot and you're a pagan. I don't think that's the necessary response. It is to lovingly say, I don't even think what you're saying holds up according to your own worldview. I did an interview with Vox Media back in February or March after the Alabama IVF Supreme Court ruling. And they wanted to ask a religious conservative why we value embryonic life. And they wanted to paint me as this religious fundamentalist. And they asked me, why do you consider embryonic life to be valuable? And I said, well, on the one hand, I'm a Christian, and I believe that every human life is made in God's image, and therefore law should extend to protections to protect image bearers made in God's image. So that's my religious answer. I said, but my kind of philosophical answer is, I think it's a little bit unjust to allow what is indisputably a human being at the earliest stage of their development to not be allowed to reach the fulfillment of their biological development. I think that that's unjust. A principle of justice is love your neighbor as yourself, treat others the way you want to be treated. I would not want to be permanently cryogenically frozen. I should not want to then cryogenically preserve my neighbors as well. And I said to the individual, you and I are having this conversation on a podcast today. You and I were once former embryos. We're the same person. We are people who had our development allowed to reach its terminal state. Embryos could be having a conversation with us right now, but they're not allowed to enter into this conversation because they're being held against their will in a state of permanent suspension. So I answered religiously, right, in accordance with Genesis 1 and 2, then provided a natural law answer, and the guy on the line was like, oh. Next question. Moved on. Why? Because in his worldview, he just thinks might makes right. He thinks two consenting adults should be able to do what they want with the embryos they create. And I think that's a fundamentally flawed worldview. Why? Because you, sir, were once an embryo. So you are unwilling to extend the logic that you want for yourself to the person that you're keeping perpetually frozen. All that to say, someone can be confronted with their errors. And the nature of unbelief is to let you rest content in inconsistency and irrationality. The beauty of being a Christian is that we get a well-rounded, comprehensive worldview where there are not irrationalities and absurdities baked in. That's something we don't think enough about in being Christians, is the intellectual fulfillment, the intellectual consistency of being a Christian. I'm not walking around wondering why I have the feelings and anger that I do when I see bad things happen in the world. I can explain that. Unbelieving neighbors cannot. How should I engage in conversations with other Christians who say they don't vote on policy, but on who they feel is a nice person, or those who say they agree with certain policies, but won't vote for that candidate because they don't like their personality? A couple things to say here would be, and this might be somewhat controversial in saying this, I would not bind someone's conscience to say that you are only biblically allowed to vote for either of the major parties. You can, you may not like this, but this is where my conscience is. I hold out for there being a principled basis for abstention because you feel like your conscience is sullied to vote for individuals that you truly find unqualified for office. I respect that. I would disagree with that, but I would respect it. I would agree with voting third party if one felt so called. I would agree with writing in a candidate. I'm not saying I agree with that I would do that. I'm saying I find those plausible explanations for a Christian to pursue. I disagree with those things. I think those are plausible, but not meaningfully going to affect material change in an outcome that has material consequence, but I respect it. And I want to be very clear on this. We do need to have character expectations for office holders. I will admit some concern in conservative Christian quarters about the downplaying of character. I'm not trying to step on any toes in saying that, but it seems like character matters less than it did previously. That can be a problem if we're seeking to excuse things. It can also be somewhat of a maturing of one's worldview to recognize character absolutely matters, but also so do all of the bundled issues over here that I have to contend for. Here's what I would say. Don't engage in the soft bigotry of low expectations. Always be pressing our office holders for good conduct, for high character. We should make those demands. Biblical office holders should be high character, high caliber individuals, ideally. I don't think that's the only consideration. And if you have someone who is, of a, Hitlerian, who's basically a would-be Adolf Hitler, I can understand saying, well, no, I'm not going to vote for that, right? But I would simply say as well, let character be measured more than by what mainstream media outlets would depict one's character as. I'm not saying that in regards to the candidates today. I'm simply saying I think that you should do some due diligence to know that we're always being presented facts from people being filtered through certain perspectives. Hold on, I think maybe I've actually just answered that one already. Oh, okay, we'll do one last question here. Thinking about working to stop the spread of the rot. How does this apply to abortion and those who are professing Christians advocating for the abolition of abortion? Yeah, so stopping the spread of abortion. Because of what has happened at the Supreme Court level, the issue has now been taken to the states. The Democrats want to nationalize abortion and restore Roe, but they can't do that. If they remove the filibuster, they could do that, which is a very significant thing to pay attention to for this upcoming election. President Trump, if he were to be reelected, said he would not sign an abortion ban because he wants the issue to go to the states. There's a debate amongst constitutional scholars of whether the issue should be federal or local. I would be fine applying a 14th Amendment test, just this across the board. I'd love to see a human life amendment. 14th Amendment would atone for a lot of the problems in my book. But while the issue is right now playing out in the states, we should not buy the lie that this, therefore, is not a federal issue in any regard. When you elect a president, you are electing a platform, yes. You are electing a personality, yes. You are also electing a whole federal bureaucracy with the powers of appointment and the powers of policymaking at the federal level, which means the funding mechanisms of the federal government into things like Planned Parenthood, things like the Mexico City policy with regard to executive orders are all matters pertaining to the executive office. So there are executive level issues with regard to abortion still in play, even if President Trump has said he wants to put those issues out to the states. All right, I think we will conclude right there.